Hi, my name is Eric Christensen, and I want to take a moment to share with you some of the major takeaways from a study that I was proud to be a part of on the economic impacts of Iowa's coal-fired power plants. This study was conducted by Iowa State University, primarily by Extension and Outreach, as a fee-for-service study funded by the Iowa Environmental Council. We'll start with some of the context of why we did this study. I'll share some of the national and local trends in the energy sector that makes it important to understand what the local effects of these power plants are. Then we'll go over some of what our results were and finally how communities can use this information. This isn't just an academic exercise. We wanted to create some baseline data communities can use as they experience transition in the energy industry. This is a graph from the US Energy Information Administration that shows the energy sources for electrical production since 1970. You can see that coal has, in recent history, been the primary generation source of electricity, but its use peaked in the mid to late 2000s. Since then, there has been a steady decline, and you can see that there are some peaks and valleys along the way, but overall, the trend is clear. So, what does this decline mean for coal power plants? Well, a lot of them are closing. You can see there nationally between 2009 and 2019, about 70 plants retired. Some of these were refueled to natural gas, but some of them closed entirely. Of those that remain, they're being used a lot less. The middle graph shows how much they have been used relative to their maximum capacity. This is affecting all coal plants. Some have been closed, some refueled. Others are simply just going to be used a lot less than they have historically. In Iowa, we have 9 utility-owned coal-fired generating stations spread throughout the state in 7 counties. The George Neal North and South plants in Woodbury County, as well as the Walter Scott Energy Center in Pottawatomie County, each have 2 separately reported generators. Now, here's Iowa's version of that graph that I showed you before nationally. In this state, coal is decreasing rapidly as an electrical generating source. You can see that wind has been the generation source that's replacing coal mostly. As an energy company representative shared in one of our focus groups, wind is becoming the main base generation source for electricity in Iowa. We're seeing these changes reflected in terms of spending and employment by these plants over the past 5 years. In 2016, they employed 712 people. By 2020, these numbers were down 99 fewer employees to just 613. Nearly 1 in 7 coal power plant jobs in Iowa disappeared in just 5 years. And there were no plant closures during that time period. The declines in spending are even more dramatic, from well over 500 million in 2016 down to just about 330 million in 2020. It's a 37% decline in overall expenditures. These changes are going to impact the communities where these power plants are located. Apart from the trends that we just shared, what do we know about the future of Iowa's coal-fired power plants? Well, Alliant Energy last year put out their Iowa Clean Energy Blueprint. They said, among other things, that with an eye towards reducing carbon dioxide emissions and delivering cleaner, more cost-effective energy, that their goal is to eliminate all coal from their generation fleet by 2040. As part of that, they announced 2 changes that are coming fairly soon. The first is that the Lansing generating station up in Alameda County is going to be closing probably in 2022. The other is that the Burlington generating station is going to be refueling. It will no longer burn coal, but instead natural gas and operate mostly as a peak generating station in times of high demand. In one of our focus groups, we had an individual from another energy company who was able to speak a little bit about their perspective on this. So I'll just read it to you. Wind is free, coal is not. So if we can spin those wind turbines, it makes a lot more economical sense, and it makes a lot more environmental sense for us to do so. Coal is still a key part of our generation portfolio, although a decreasing part of our generation portfolio. We're just going to be shifting the way that we use those plants across the board in Council Bluffs and elsewhere to meet market demands, market preferences, and to accommodate the increased presence of renewables across our generation portfolio. The energy companies are honest about this. Coal is not going to be used in the way that it was before. These are changes that are coming, and communities need to understand the impact these plants are having in their communities and how to prepare for what's next. That is the main reason why we did this report. We know that one of 3 things is going to be happening to all of these coal-fired power plants. Either they're going to be closed down, They're going to be refueled to natural gas, or they're going to be used quite a bit less than they have historically. Any of these outcomes is going to have effect on the communities where these plants are located. It's important for local governments, economic developers, and the business community to understand what these changes are going to mean for them. That's the reason we did this study and why we hope that you'll take the opportunity to learn from it. Iowa isn't the only state where this research has been done. Indiana, Minnesota, and many other states out west have done similar studies to try to understand what's the future going to look like for these communities. So we know these changes are coming. We know they're going to have local effects. So what kind of data can we gather to help us prepare? This report is a series of 7 studies in which we examine the counties where these power plants are located to understand their effect locally. In each county, we're looking at the plant from 5 different angles to understand their effects. The first one is jobs. The people who are going to be most affected by whatever happens to these plants are the individuals that work there. These are really well-paying jobs that, especially in some of the more rural communities, stand out as being some of the best work in the community. We also took a look at utility tax replacement. Utilities don't pay property tax in Iowa like other industries. Instead, there's an excise tax on the generation, transmission, and delivery of electricity. That money is collected by the state and sent back to the counties more or less to replace what they would receive from property tax. One of the factors that goes into deciding how much money goes back locally is how much energy is being generated by these plants. So, as they're generating less, or in some cases closing, these utility tax replacement payments are going to be reduced. We also looked very importantly at local spending. These plants are paying their employees, they're also purchasing local goods and services. Those have ripple effects in the local economy. We used an economic impact model to map out those ripple effects and understand what other industries might be affected. We also understand that community identity is often tied up to major industries in a community. And so we did a countywide survey in each of the counties where a power plant is located and asked individuals about their thoughts about the future of the plant, benefits and drawbacks of having the plant there, and some of the concerns that they might have if they were to hear that the plant was going to close. Finally, we also held focus groups and conducted interviews with local elected officials, economic developers, members of the business community to understand what other effects that plant might have beyond those that we can capture by calculating the dollars and cents. The first aspect that we're going to go over here is the replacement jobs. We wanted to understand how power plant jobs compare with the wider job market. Dr. Peter Erasm, a labor economist at Iowa State University, did this research. He took a list of occupations that we had from the plants along with their wages and analyzed them to understand the basic skills needed to do these jobs and what equivalent jobs need the same skill set. He used the Occupational Outlook Handbook from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to identify these potential equivalent jobs. There's a lot of detail in the report, but some of the big takeaways from this were that overall, there are a lot of jobs in the state that need the skills that workers in these power plants have. But for the most part, pay at the electric utilities is greater, and in some cases, much greater than pay in similar jobs. Additionally, there was not a huge difference in pay for this work between metropolitan and more rural areas. To understand economic impacts, we used a model called IMPLAN. IMPLAN is an economic analysis tool that uses what's called input-output modeling to understand the local effects of any economic activity. A really simplified version of this model is this. So imagine in each county you have a power plant. That plant is doing a lot of things to interact with local economy. One of the primary ways is by paying wages to employees. Those plants are then also making local purchases of goods and services from local firms. And they're also buying goods and services from firms that are located outside of the county, in this case, mostly fuel. Those are considered loss to the local economy. Now, these are the direct impacts of the power plant, but the dollars and cents don't stop there. What happens next is that those employees, they also go out and spend money. They spend some money locally and some outside of the area, maybe buy something on Amazon. That money's lost to the economy, but their local spending continues to drive local economic activity. Those local firms that the power plant is purchasing from, likewise, they are paying wages to employees. They're also making non-local purchases, and they're also buying from other local firms, goods and services. So you can see there's this kind of web where many transactions that indirectly start with the money that came from the power plant. A simple depiction of this might be that the power plant pays wages to an employee. That employee goes to a restaurant to buy a meal. That restaurant pays wages to the chef. That chef might use that money to pay his rent. And then that landlord might use that money for something else to pay for a service. That goes on and on and on. And what Implan tries to do is really map and capture this chain of economic activity. These are the overall results by county. They're significant. They range from around 13.5 million up to over $118 million. This is expected local economic impacts in just 2020. Industry output here just means the sales of all goods and services in the county that we can trace back to that power plant's local spending. The column on the right, percentage of local output, that shows what percentage of the total local economy in these counties that Implan predicts is due to the economic activity of the power plant. You can see that in Alameda County, it's over 4% of all local economic activity that the model predicts is ultimately due to money spent, either wages paid or local purchases made by the Lansing generating station. Overall, in all the counties we looked at, the average is about 0.5%. I also want to point out here that we combined Louisa and Muscatine counties for this analysis because their economies were very highly linked. I really want to encourage you to read the full report because there's a lot of detail on each county that we just can't go into here. But one of the things that's nice about the model that we used is that it doesn't just give us the big number to show us the overall economic impact. It allows us to dig a little deeper to see which sectors are most linked to the activity at the power plant. You can see that by far the largest single sector is utilities themselves. Now, we're not actually including anything in terms of sales of electricity from the power plant in this number. This number is all economic activity in the utility sector, but outside of the power plants themselves. A lot of this is in transmission, distribution, sales, and other activities in the utility sector that's supported by that power plant being there. It's important to point out that in this or any of the other sectors, that we're not necessarily saying that all this activity would go away if a plant were to close. As power plants are phased out or closed, there will still be a need for electrical transmission, distribution, and many of these other utility functions. It might change a little bit exactly how it's used, maybe where in the state it's coming from, but these functions are still going to be needed. Some of the other big industries that are supported are transportation and warehousing, government industries, administration, waste services, and real estate and rental. We're also able to look at local employment supported by the power plant. How many jobs? So once again, utilities by far are the most significant industry here. We have those 613 individuals who work directly for the plants, but there are another 160 that work in the utility industry outside of those plants. There's also 240 in administrative and waste services, 164 in transportation and warehousing, and 112 in retail trade. Once again, you can head to the report to check out the whole list broken down statewide and also for each of the counties that we looked at. Statewide, there are ultimately about 2,000, almost 2,000 jobs that are supported by these power plants. Another significant impact of these plants are those local utility tax replacement payments that go to all the taxing agencies. You can see it's primarily going to schools, but also to counties, cities, townships, and community college, other local taxing entities. For schools, it's significant. It's, in terms of average percentage of their budgeted revenues, almost 3% from the 2020-2021 fiscal year. It's also significant for some of the larger cities, including Cedar Rapids and Council Bluffs, which are the two cities that do have a power plant within their borders. It's important for local officials to understand these numbers and how they might change as they're putting together long-term budgets, capital improvement plans, and bond repayment schedules. In addition to these economic numbers, we wanted to understand what people think about these plants. There's often a lot of community identity tied up into major local industries, and any talk of change can be scary. The results in this study are reported by counties, and you can see the differences of opinions from place to place. Overall, people see that these plants are very important to their local economies. On a scale from not important at all down at 1 or up to extremely important at 5, people see these plants as being a 4.1 out of 5, very important to their local economy. There are many other questions on the full survey, but we also wanted to point out what concerns individuals might have if they were to hear that the plant was closing. The number one concern across the state were job losses. People understand that these jobs are very good and that they're going to be hard to replace, especially at the wages that people are making now. Another big concern, and this one was a bit of a surprise, was a possible increase in utility bills. More than 82% of people who responded to us were worried that if they heard that a coal power plant was closing, that it might mean an increase in their utility bill. Other concerns were decreasing local tax base, other businesses closing, decrease in school population, etc. Some of the other responses included worries about energy security and whether other energy sources would be enough or would be adequate if coal were to go away. Addressing all of these concerns is going to be key as energy companies and local officials talk about the future of coal in Iowa. For each of these counties, we also pulled together local elected officials, appointed officials, business leaders, economic developers, and others to talk about how they see these plans. What are some of the benefits, drawbacks, and what do they understand to be the future of these plans? I think these are one of the more interesting parts of the whole report, and there's a wide range of perspectives across the state. But here I'm going to pull together some of the major themes that we saw. We started asking about the benefits, and here in Alameda County, they said that the power plant pays the top end wages in the county. We don't have a ton of union jobs here. This was pretty consistent across the state, one of the first things mentioned. Others said it goes deeper than just the people that are employed there. You might have one individual in a family working there, but the rest of the family and other relatives stay to be close together. If you lost that job, you might lose more than one family. Also, in Wapello County, someone mentioned kids need to know that jobs like that exist in the area. It's a destination. Some other benefits that were mentioned were here, we all know that Texas moment. We went through negative 28 degrees here in Siouxland and we did not lose power. That's because they're able to keep it going through the peaks. Once again, people seem to have a lot of confidence in coal relative to other sources of electricity. We need something to keep the lights on, and I don't think batteries are there yet, said someone in Wapello County. And finally, in Des Moines County, an official shared, the noises I hear about things that are better to replace coal are all a little airy. We also asked about drawbacks. One individual shared, I can't speak to the emissions, but no matter how much you scrub it, coal's a dirty fuel. In Alameda County, an official shared, it's a picturesque area, and coal trains are not always attractive to look at. Speaking of coal trains, many, especially with the school district, mentioned that we wouldn't have as many school bus delays if coal trains weren't coming in. Some of those coal trains go pretty slow. Then we also asked about the future, and this is where we saw some of the biggest differences among communities. Some did see that potentially changes were coming. For example, the big buzz right now in Lynn County is solar. So I think the future is moving towards more renewable energy sources. So I don't know how long coal will be sustainable. Others mentioned it's going to close eventually, at least with the current federal administration. They're pushing to close the coal plant. So seeing kind of changes as being politically driven. Overall, though, most were skeptical that the coal plants would be going anywhere. I see it as a long-term resource for the community. That was, in most counties, the first reaction when I asked that question. I also shared some of the information that we went through earlier about changes that we're seeing, some of the public statements that have been made by energy companies, and mostly I was met with skepticism around that. I couldn't see a Midwestern state going coal-free. I think anything they are saying now about closing in 20 years is just responding to the current political environment. One of the challenges that we face is helping local decision makers recognize that this isn't just a hypothetical change. This is already happening to our local economies, and our local economies are already feeling the effects. To repeat myself from earlier, 1 in 7 coal-fired power plant jobs disappeared just in the past 5 years. And during that same time frame, we saw a 37% decline in spending. So how can communities prepare for the future? And how can the information contained in this report help with that? Well, each community has their own economy, their own local preferences, and their own timeline. But I'm going to focus on what all communities can do now. So briefly, it's to start planning early, think beyond redevelopment of the site, maintain open communication, and seek out peer communities. In terms of planning early, I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal interest in economic development and community development in general. In my hometown when I was growing up, the Northwestern Steel and Wire Company closed in 2001. There were 1,500 people directly employed by the plant and another 7,500 who relied on the plant for their pension. My mother was one of those employees who lost her job. After nearly 100 years of operation, the plant closed quickly and it was a major shock to our local economy and our community as a whole. A researcher named Daniel Bliss wrote a book about the local response to the closure. published in 2018. Although both Sterling and Rock Falls, my hometown, were both heavily affected by the closure, there was a difference in the response of these two cities and ultimately how quickly they were able to recover. And it really kind of emphasized this central point that economic development requires a lot of local time, attention, resources. But once this closure is announced, not all of those are really easy to come by. When the closure was announced of Northwestern Steel and Wire, Sterling already had a public-private partnership for economic development, and they were immediately be able to dive in, focusing on recruiting new employers, managing the city's business incubator, and starting to develop right away a strategic plan for the site. Rock Falls first had to begin to reform its local institutions, even the way its local government operated, before they could even really begin doing real economic development, while Sterling was already way ahead implementing policy. Now, today there's a much more diverse local business scene in Sterling, and Rock Falls has made up some of the ground in the past 20 years. But as someone who was growing up there at the time, I can tell you that the difference in progress between the two communities was evident and continued to be for many years. Being prepared and having good proactive economic development policy and planning in place before an announcement like this comes helps to avoid potential issues. We hope that as communities work on their economic development plans, that they understand that there may be changes coming to the energy sector, and using the data in this report, focus on those industries that may need additional support. Another key that we've seen from the literature and on the closure of power plants and other major industrial sites around the country is that local economic developers should think beyond redevelopment of that site. A lot of times, that specific unused industrial site can draw a lot of attention. And while redevelopment of the location is going to be part of a long-term economic recovery strategy, oftentimes the site's ownership, maybe environmental remediation that needs to happen, existing infrastructure, buildings that need to come down, all those things can make the site very difficult to redevelop quickly. That Northwestern Steel and Wire site I talked about closed 20 years ago, and while some of it has been redeveloped and reopened, they're still working on a lot of it. Progress is being made all the time, but there's a lot of money, a lot of attention that goes into that. In the meantime, local economic developers, local industry, local officials need to think about other industries. What are other sites? If you're looking for a place to start, some of the industries that are affected by the slowdown may have additional capacity or be looking for new clients in the year to come. On communication, if you're taking a look at the report, I think one of the most interesting things to read is Alameda County talking about their experience. They're living through an announced closure right now, although the plant is still there. One of the things that they said was so important for what has so far been a successful local response was open communication. One individual shared, "I was really glad that we had a good relationship with Alliant. Open communication was a really big piece of that. Often they can't tell you everything, but say you should be prepared for this." Even before the announcement was public, there were already conversations between Alliant and local officials that helped them get prepared. And communication goes both ways. Local officials were also able to get that information out to the public and enable them to say, "We know this is going to be a significant portion of our school budget that's going to be affected, but we've already had a chance to think about it. And here's our plan to keep the school open. And here's what we're going to do to avoid major impacts on taxes." The folks in the community that I spoke to were fairly confident that it was going to be handled well. And a lot of that was because Alliant was open about their plans. Local officials had a chance to wrap their heads around it, strategize, and get information out to the public quickly and clearly. This is another area where we think this study can be useful. The utilities and local officials can understand what the public's general opinion is about these plans so they can respond to concerns that are there locally. Finally, we recommend that any community that's looking at a downsizing or closure to seek out peer communities. A large plant closure is a complex and hopefully very rare event, and local officials might face a steep learning curve. Have conversations with others who have gone through the same things and ask, what are the things we need to be thinking about? What went well in your experience? What would you have done differently? And what should we do now to prepare? Iowa's coal communities are not alone. Over the past decade, as we showed you, there have been dozens of large power plant closures across the country, and many more going through the process, including Alameda County in Iowa. It doesn't have to be just communities that lost power plants. Many cities in Iowa have gone through similar transitions, including the city of Newton when the Maytag company closed. Seek out those successful communities and imitate what they did well. Now, within this study, we only focused on a very small part of the energy industry. We only focused on coal power plants, but the energy industry supports many diverse jobs in Iowa in the transmission, renewables, and energy management sectors. Now, changes are occurring, but these changes are going to present challenges, but they also present opportunities. Potential impacts of these closures or slowdowns are going to be real, but they are manageable. With good information and proper planning, you can prepare for the future now. Thank you so much. The full report is available for download on the Iowa Environmental Council's website, and please reach out if you have any questions at all. I thank you for your time and attention and to the Iowa Environmental Council for funding this research.